Be very careful with the stories you tell yourself, that you're not telling yourself something that's not true based on what God has said. Because here's the thing, we have our own thoughts and God has his thoughts. I think Isaiah says his thoughts are not our thoughts. But the beauty is this: God is trying to teach us to think like him, to trust him, to walk with him every day of our lives as followers of Jesus Christ. Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another episode of Connecting Faith and Life. I'm your host, Mr. Brown. And this week is a busy week for me because we're at Vacation Bible School at Valley Christian Church, or VC Family as we call it. And today was the first day, and it was fun. My responsibility is teaching memory verses all week. I'm teaching 3 verses this week: Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23, Joshua 1:9, and Acts 4:12. And the whole theme this week is kind of dealing with the same thing I'm dealing with the thought of the day, which we're going to play a part of this podcast. It's the idea of the land of giants, right? The land of giants. And so we're teaching the kids about when God sent the 10 spies in, and how they didn't want to go into the land because they thought that they looked like grasshoppers for these people. These people are too big, and they doubted God's provision for them. They doubted that God would be faithful. And our first verse talks about the Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23. Hebrews 10:23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Hebrews 10:23. And that verse is so important to remember in my life every day, that God is faithful. I need to understand that God will be faithful to the promises that he made to himself and to us. Like, ultimately, it's for God's glory. God will not deny himself the glory due his own name. So he will work on us, through us, with us. God's going to work his plans. And so the people of Israel, his own people, doubted him. So they ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But think about that for our own lives. And here's the catch. Just the thought of the day, which we're going to watch in a moment. Here's the thought of the day. Be careful with the stories you tell yourself, because sometimes we don't tell ourselves the right stories. We create this narrative that is incorrect, and we begin to live that way, just like they did in Numbers chapter 13. They began to live by this narrative that they felt like they were grasshoppers, they were too little, and they thought that the other people saw them as grasshoppers, too little, and they began to think that they couldn't do this. And in a sense, they were right. They couldn't do it themselves, but they had to trust in the one who is faithful, the one who promised that he would give them the land. But they refused to do that. They believed their own narrative, the negative one, and did not enter the promised land. Only 2 people, Joshua and Caleb, entered the promised land. And honestly, I'm gonna tell you the truth about me when it comes to the names Joshua and Caleb. I always mix them up because my brother-in-law's name is Josh. His name is Josh, or his name is Caleb, but they call him Joshi. So I think his middle name is Joshua or Caleb. I don't even know what his name is anymore because I'm so confused about him being called both names. But in the Bible, they're 2 different people. But in my family, it's one person. But the point is this: those 2 believed, and they were able to enter the promised land, but the rest didn't. They wandered for 40 years because of the negative story they told themselves, that they could not defeat the people in the promised land that God had promised. And I want you to think about that in your own life. As you listen to this thought of the day, listen to it, contemplate it, pray about what stories you tell yourself. Be very careful with the stories you tell yourself, that you're not telling yourself something that's not true based on what God has said. Because here's the thing, we have our own thoughts and God has his thoughts. I think Isaiah says his thoughts are not our thoughts. But the beauty is this: God is trying to teach us to think like him, to trust him, to walk with him every day of our lives as followers of Jesus Christ. So hope you enjoy this thought of the day, and hopefully this video and everything we make will help you live for God by connecting faith and life. Enjoy this podcast or this video, the thought of the day. Hello, I'm Mr. Brown, and this is the thought of the day. The thought of the day is simple: be careful with the stories you tell yourself. This is why, because we could be wrong, off. We could just be way out of the park with what we think is going on. And I remember as a kid thinking, man, my mama this, my mama that. I thought I knew everything, and I didn't have the whole picture. I know the whole story, but I was making my mind up that my mom was wrong about this. She should let me do this. She let me do that. I was way off. I mean, I was so off. Just crazy, right? And it's so important that in our lives, we don't just tell ourselves a story, because we can be so wrong. And we think about that story over and over again. We tell ourselves that people don't love us, or this is the situation. And I'm not saying those things can't happen, but pump the brakes. Get another point of view, and most importantly, seek God about the truth. There's a verse in the Bible that I keep coming back to, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. That word lean is like to rely on your understanding. I like the fact that it didn't say you shouldn't have an understanding. Yes, God has given us a mind to think with, to process the world with. Yes, we should think. We should use our mind. But we should not lean on our own understanding only. We should lean on God's understanding, because God sees what we don't see. God knows the truth we don't know. And it's important that we take our thoughts and put them through the filter of what God says. That can be through his word, through prayer, through the Holy Spirit. But we need to make sure that we're not leaning to our own understanding and making up these stories in our heads based on our emotions, our feelings, our momentary thoughts, but making sure that we take those and bring them to the Lord. Reminds me of a story in the Bible in Numbers chapter 13, where God told Moses, hey, tell the people, I'm going to give them this land. Send out some spies, this land I'm going to give you, right? And tell them to check out the land. Well, they did. These 12 spies went. Was it 13 spies? 12 spies. Numbers 13, yeah. 12 spies. They went out to check out the land, right? And they saw this amazing land. And they brought back these huge grapes on a pole. And they came back and they were like, oh, this is an amazing place. Flowing milk and honey. But look how big the fruit are. And then they were like, but we can't do this. Nah, we can't take this. There's no way we can take the land. So 10 of them said, no, we can't have it. But God said they could. And Caleb and Joshua were like, no, we can. We can trust God to do this, right? We can do this. And they didn't listen to them. They wanted to stone them because they heard their own story. And they were going to kill their own brethren, so to speak, because they had such doubt that they could do. They looked at the people and they doubted God. They told themselves a story. We can't do this. Matter of fact, it got so bad because their story they were telling themselves wasn't true. Look at what it says. In Numbers 13:33, it says this, and there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from Nephil. I don't know how to say that word. And we seemed to ourselves as grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. That's what that said. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So in their minds, they felt like they saw themselves as grasshoppers, they could not defeat these people. And so we seem like that to them. That is so crucial because the stories you tell yourself, you're projecting other people. Like, oh, they don't love me, they don't like me, they don't care about me. That's how you may see yourself, but then you begin to project on other people and then you begin to live that out. And that happens so often in our culture today. What we think, we project what other people think, therefore we move on that. For an example, even with this whole race thing, people say, well, how do you feel being a black man living in a predominantly white community when people look at you funny? Are they racist? I don't know. I don't know why they're looking at me funny. And I refuse to tell myself a negative story unless you come up to me and say something negative, say something about that. I'm not going to project on you what I think you might be thinking because I don't know what you think. And you know what that is? That's called bondage. If you're living your life telling yourself a story that everybody else is out to get you, everybody else is after you for whatever reason, you're in bondage because you don't know that for a fact. And until I know that for a fact, I'm going to live in a place of freedom and not worry about that. They were in bondage so much to what they thought would happen. They refused to listen to God and say, God, you're going to give us this land? Hey, God, you're the one that brought us out of Egypt. You took us to the Red Sea. You did all these things in the past. We're going to ignore all of that. We're going to ignore the past successes you've given us. We're going to ignore that you're the God of the universe and the power you have. We're going to look at this. We believe we're grasshoppers. We're too little for these people. We can't handle it. And you look at it, you're like, that's crazy. But how often do we do the same thing? When we begin to look at ourselves and project what we think we are instead of looking at what God and who God says we are. That's why I think it's so important we know who God is and what God has said about us, what God planned for our lives, for his creatures, for his children. I don't even say his creatures because, yeah, everybody's created by God, but when we trust Christ, we become his children. And how does God look at us? How does God want us to live? And so they begin to grumble against Moses and Aaron, and they wanted to actually stone them, but God intervened. And it's so sad because the next chapter, they were like, man, we should go back to Egypt. Hey, let's point us a leader and take us back to Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. They were beaten. They were poorly treated in Egypt. God rescued them from that. And they told themselves such a story. They wove such a narrative in their minds. Being afraid of these people was so bad. They had to go back to Egypt in bondage. That's crazy. But guess what? We can do the same things. So again, the thought of the day, be careful with the stories you tell yourself because you can be off, you can be wrong, you can be way wrong. But instead, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not to your own understanding, but in all your ways, acknowledge him, acknowledge who he is, what he's done in the past, what he's doing now, and what he's able to do. Acknowledge him in all your ways, and he will make your path straight. He was trying to do that for the Israelites. He would tell, hey, this is the path I want you to go down. But they're like, nah, God, we good. Nope, can't do that. We like grasshoppers to these folks. We can't do it. And again, they were leaning to their own understanding. Not only that, relying on themselves and not on the power of God. The same God who led them out of Egypt through the Red Sea, freed them, but yet he can't do what he says he's going to do. And I think we have to make sure that we know who God is and we can rely on him and lean not to our own understanding, rely on ourselves, but truly rely on him.